And to begin this section of scriptural reasoning, I'm going to hand back over to Rabbi Jason to explore this text here from Exodus.
Thank you very much, Jake. Just a little bit of context before we go into the text. Some of you may be familiar with the story of Moses, whether it's from the Bible or Prince of Egypt animation or whatever. If you remember back in the beginning of the book of Exodus, the Jewish people, they're not yet the Jewish people, they're a large Hebrew family. They interestingly become identified as a kind of a growing nation by Egypt. And they become slaves, if you remember. The head of Egypt, the Pharaoh, the king, is concerned there's becoming so many of them. What if they take over? So they become enslaved. And the Pharaoh knows that there is a prophecy, there is a belief amongst the Hebrews, the Jewish people, that a Redeemer will come to lead them. And the Pharaoh is concerned that that will weaken his power and he'll be taken over by the Jews. So he adopts a policy of throwing baby boys into the River Nile. Of course, one of those is Moses. And we know the story of how Moses is put in a basket. Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses, pity on him, brings him home. And the reason in Jewish tradition we're told that Pharaoh spares him, because how come he should be spared? He's a Jewish baby, is that Pharaoh realizes this must be the future Redeemer. If I can turn him, if I can actually bring him under my household, and he can succeed me and be true to Egypt rather than be a threat to Egypt. So this is relevant because when the text begins on verse 11 of chapter 2 of Exodus, it says, sometime after, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk, meaning that Moses knows he's of Jewish origin. He knows he was a Hebrew, but he was taken in by Pharaoh. He now has this role as a prince of Egypt. And so there's a whole issue here about his identity. Who is he? Does he represent Egypt, which is has taken him in, and he is in a Pharaoh's household? But this regime is oppressing his brethren, oppressing the people that he comes from, his kinsfolk, and he witnessed their labors. This is the first time he's actually seeing them beaten and treated so badly. What does he see? Continuation of verse 11. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. He turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So what was going on here is that this Egyptian taskmaster was beating this Hebrew to such a degree that had nobody done anything, the Jewish slave would have been murdered. So Moses takes action. He stops the beating of his fellow Jew, even though he's identified as an Egyptian, Moses, at this stage. But the text talks about his kinsman. In order to stop the Egyptian, the only way he can stop him is to kill him, which is what he does, and hid him in the sand. Verse 13, when he went out the next day, he found two Hebrews fighting. So he said to the offender, "Why do you strike your fellow?" The offender retorted, "Who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" So this is interesting. You would have thought the two Jews would see Moses as a champion of defending them, given that he took action against an Egyptian taskmaster. They actually say, "Who are you to tell us not to fight? Look at what you did to the Egyptian." They're critical of him. One idea is that they actually feel things are going to be worse for them because now no longer will he be of use to Pharaoh. Moses is a fugitive. Moses has done an act which is known that he's done this. Even if the Egyptian was hidden in the sand, clearly these two people know what he's done. And that's why the text continues. Moses was frightened and thought, the matter is known. I've been uncovered. What I've done is known. I'm on the run. I'm going to be cast out from Egypt, given that I took the action that I did. Verse 15, when Pharaoh learned of the matter, he sought to kill Moses. Moses fled from Pharaoh. So he's the refugee. He's seeking refuge elsewhere because now he's persecuted as a result of what he did. He arrived, settled in the land of Midian, and sat down beside a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Shepherds came and drove them off. Moses rose to their defense, and he watered their flock. And when they came to Reuel, their father, Reuel, by the way, is another name, he's more popularly known as Jethro. Jethro. So when they came to Reuel, who is also Jethro, he said, "Who is it that you have come? How is it that you have come back so soon today?" He's surprised they're back, because normally they're hassled so much by the shepherd to prevent them from being able to water their flock. But they came back quickly because Moses had helped them. Verse 19, they answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he then? Why did you leave the man? Ask him to break bread." And Moses consented to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah as wife. She bore a son, whom he named Gershom, but he said, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land." That's because the Hebrew word Gershom means stranger. That's why he was called a stranger, because he has been a stranger. Moses has been a stranger in a foreign land. Let's just unpack a few ideas here, fascinating ideas relating to the concept of refugees, how we treat them, how they feel. I feel in this text there are actually two sets of refugees. Obviously, there's Moses, but then Moses, who is the one fleeing from persecution, fleeing from being oppressed, sees the daughters of Jethro being oppressed. So isn't that interesting? You would have thought that the refugee is entitled to be the one to be protected and looked after and given help, rather than expecting help from the refugee. Yet Moses, who is the refugee, sees these ladies being harassed by the he's in a strange land, he knows nobody. He goes to their aid. He makes a contribution for them to such an extent that they go back and explain to their father how this Egyptian helped them, and he's described as an Egyptian who rescued us from the shepherds. So this strikes me, you find these amazing people who they themselves have gone through terrible difficulties and challenges. And look at Moses back in Egypt, before he did what he did to come to the aid of somebody who was being oppressed. He was a prince. He was important. All of that was thrown away. Everything that he'd known had been thrown away because of a change in his circumstances. And sometimes you find this with refugees, whether they've come from Afghanistan or wherever they've come from, they may have had particularly prominent positions and been in a position of being self-sufficient, and now find themselves, their world completely turned upside down. And they're starting from scratch. And yet look how often they make such a valuable contribution to the well-being of others, often not expecting to be helped, even though they're entitled to be helped, because they themselves are vulnerable. And what do we see? That this foreigner, this Egyptian, is welcomed. And what does, again, Jake, sorry if I'm cutting into early here, he'll ask later a quote, but clearly it seems to me that ask him to break bread is the key thing here. The refugees must be welcomed, they must be supported, they must not feel alienated. And we see that not only does Jethro call Reuel in this part of the text, give his daughter to Moses as a wife, but the family is established in this new place. Even though Moses never forgets his origins and he knows where he comes from, he's been accepted in this new situation. So I think there's a lot to think about there in terms of lessons about how we treat refugees, how they feel, what they've given up, what they contribute. And I think this is so relevant to many issues going on in society today.
Thank you very much for that, and we'll be coming back to that a little bit later in the questions. And again, just to remind schools and teachers that as we go along, do feel free to pop questions in the chat bar. Tell us who you want those addressed to, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. So if we could pass on to George for a reflection in light of this passage from Matthew in the New Testament.
Okay, shall I read it first?
Yes, please.
This comes from the Gospel of St. Matthew. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will answer them, Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. So these are again words of Jesus recorded in the gospel. And I was saying in the previous session how for Christians, the gospels are very important. We have 4 of them, and we believe that they give us the words of Jesus, the actions of Jesus, and they describe his life. And in particular, they describe the way in which he suffered and died and rose again. Jesus, of course, is held in great reverence by the Christian church because we believe that Jesus was the incarnate Son of God, so God made man. And we, as I say, esteem the Gospels because they tell us so much about Jesus. They are a record. This Gospel was written by Matthew, recording things that were held within the Christian community, setting them down in writing, quite a long time after Jesus had actually died and rose again. So they come to us as a record, and Matthew in particular is very fond of the idea of the kingdom of heaven. That's one of his big themes, the kingdom of heaven. And he records Jesus saying, the kingdom of heaven is upon you. The kingdom of heaven, what does it mean? Well, it's something like God's way of doing things, God's rule. God is coming to achieve his purposes in their fullness on earth. And with that comes the notion of judgment, and judgment between the good and the bad, the righteous and the sinful. And just before this passage that we've heard now, Jesus says, the time will come when the Son of Man will come with his angels in judgment of the earth. And so this section is a passage about how are we to be judged, by what criteria, who decides what it is that we have done that is going to earn us salvation or perdition, loss. And here in this section, we're given an idea. It's confusing because it talks about the king saying to people, but I think we take it in the church as meaning that when we serve those in need, we are serving Christ. We are serving the one who came and is often described as the servant of us all. So we're in the topsy-turvy world of the Christian gospel here, where when you are in need, when you are persecuted, you are actually very close to God. And we see this in Jesus' life. Of course, the one who was persecuted, the one who was oppressed by others, the one who gave his life as an innocent person on the cross. So we are encouraged to follow in that way of Christ, and we are encouraged to ourselves be people who are compassionate and people who are mindful to serve the poor, and people who should see Christ in those who suffer and in those who are, in all those categories there, thirsty, naked, in prison. And so this has been the inspiration, I suppose, for a lot of Christian action and Christian work with the poor and the disadvantaged. And refugees come right into that category. You may think that, well, society judges and rewards those who work hard and are established in society. But actually, Christianity says, well, no, perhaps the way of faith is the way of loss, persecution, some of those things we saw in the first, the previous gospel, the way of giving to others and not seeking anything in return. So we sum it up, we tend to sum it up as the way of service of others and compassion towards others. That's at the core of the gospel, because we believe that our Lord trod the path of poverty and nakedness. So it's about work as well as faith. What we do is as important as what we believe, and we can see what we believe through what we do. So there's not really a distinction. It's all of a piece, and we're encouraged as Christians to live all of a piece. And we hope when judgment comes that we will be judged by the sort of people we are, which will be reflected in the sort of things we did and the sort of life that we led. Is that okay?
Thank you very much for that, George. And we'll just go to our last text, an extract from the Quran. And Maysoon, if you could pick up from here, that would be fantastic.
Okay, thank you, Jake. So just to give a quick background before I do start reading, again, it's from the Quran, chapter number 28, verse number 20 to 24, and it's Surah Al-Qasas. So anybody who is familiar with the Arabic language, it's the story, but it's chapter under the name of Surah Al-Qasas. So before I do read a bit of background, Prophet Moses, who we as Muslims believe is a prophet to us, he saw an argument broke out between two people from the children of Israel, and he decided to side one of them, and in doing so, as an accident, he attacked one of them, and which caused the death of that individual. And here then the story starts from the Quran, where a man came running from the furthest part of the city and said, "Moses, the authorities are talking about killing you, so leave. This is my sincere advice." So Moses left the city, fearful and wary, and prayed, "My Lord, save me from people who do wrong," as he made his way towards Midian. He was saying, "May my Lord guide me to the right way." When he arrived at Midian's waters, he found a group of men watering their flocks, and beside them 2 women keeping their flocks back. So he said, "What is the matter with you two?" They said, "We cannot water our flocks until the shepherds take their sheep away. Our father is a very old man. He watered their flocks for them, withdrew into the shade, and prayed, 'My Lord, I am in dire need of whatever good thing you may send me.'" Now, Moses, we find, left and traveled from Egypt, which was his home country where he was born, to a place called Midian due to fear of persecution. He was fearful in his own country due to a tyrant ruler, Pharaoh. So he decided to leave and take the sincere advice which was offered to him. Now then, Midian to Egypt is roughly about an 8-day journey. So as you can see, and imagine 8 days traveling, he must be really tired. He must be lethargic, hungry, and everything else that you can think of. But still, he made the prayer to God. He made the prayer that may God guide me to the right way. May God save me from the people who are doing wrong. And when he did get to Midian, to where he was meant to go to, he found a group of 2 women trying to water the flocks, but they wasn't able to do that because of the shepherds and the herds and just the restrictions with the men wanting to take leadership before the women were allowed to flock their sheep. But what he did was, even though he was tired, even though he was hungry, he decided to help out. So he himself is a refugee, he himself is a foreigner in someone else's country, in someone else's land, but he still did not give up the resistance of trying to help someone. We can see that he was hungry towards the end of that verse. If we look, we can see that he says to God, "My Lord, I am in dire need of whatever good thing you may send me." So we can see that he was hungry, but he didn't give up his duty towards others. So in Islam, as a Muslim, we are forever taught to welcome refugees, to be those who open arms and allows those people who are being persecuted, to give them shelter, to house them, to home them. And this is why several mosques during the time of COVID not only helped the refugees from outside and from abroad, but even within their own country, within the UK, they opened food banks, they sheltered and gave those individuals who were either homeless or who had no food. So this is at the core values of Islam, of always trying to be dutiful. And if we look back to our very, very first lecture that we thought, it's a duty, it's a responsibility, and it's accountability, something that we can't shy away from as Muslims.
Thank you very much for that. We've got no questions in the chat feed at the moment, but I've got a few things that I know would certainly be relevant to our GCSE students, and I've got a threefold kind of question here. And actually, Maysoon, I'll probably start with you because you've already answered part of that. As part of GCSE studies, and if subject leaders have decided to move this across school, we look at beliefs and we look at practices. And in the practices section, we reflect on, okay, well, what's the religious teaching? And then, well, what are you actually going to do about it? So because of the teaching in this text, what is it that Muslims are actually going to do? So we'd like some examples of practical action. And then it would be great if you could recommend us a organisation, perhaps a charity, within your faith that it would be worth our students exploring to refer to in their answers. So just to make that a bit more clear, what examples of practical action are expected from the faith community, and what organisations could be supported to back that up?
Okay, thank you for your question, Jake. I quite rightly, like you say, I have quite just touched upon it in my previous answer, but I'll reiterate, Muslims are expected to welcome and shelter those who have no shelter. We are expected to accommodate refugees. So whether that, because the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was where he's narrated to have said, if you are cooking yourself something, add in extra water. Add in extra water so you have a bit more soup that you can give to your neighbor. So if this is the teachings that we are taught from our Prophet, the final messenger, then we need to make sure that we are enacting this and not just listening to it in a theoretical aspect. We're actually doing practicalities of it too. Now, there are several mosques across Britain who are doing this. I have seen at the height of COVID that not only refugees from abroad have been accommodated, but the homelessness, those individuals, those who don't have shelter, who live in the UK, those who are frail, the elderly, the poor, those people who can't even go outside their house to collect prescriptions, so to speak. So the Muslim community and the local mosques have been making their voices heard and just going out and seeking the pleasure of God in trying to help and assist those individuals who were vulnerable and were unable to go out and do things like this. So the theoretical aspect is there, the teachings are there for us to do that. And thankfully, Muslims are following suit and they are going out and putting the learning into practice. The organisations that you ask for, I would direct the students to the Muslim Council of Britain. They are an umbrella body, so they hold links to all the mosques and all the localities within certain regions. So I'm aware that we've got different schools from different areas on this platform today. So if they search up the Muslim Council of Britain, they will find a wealth of information which will hopefully benefit them and kind of take them further in their leads that they want to take and get the information that they need.
Thank you so much for that. And as we have done in other sessions, and obviously if you're from a school who's attended those, one thing that we are looking to do is focus on some specific quotes. So whilst I'm just reminding people, Mason, you might want to think about what specific quote we might recommend, because in the best answers, really what we want to see is a piece of that text included. But of course, we can't be giving the whole thing. It has to be something quite specific. So if we were going to say, to the students, what might be a good quotation from this passage for them to memorize and then include and analyze as part of their answers?
Definitely, students, to get the higher marks, you definitely need to be cross-referencing and then applying that reference within your answers. So my recommendation would be the prayer that Moses made, which is right towards the end of the verse, which is, "My Lord, I am in dire need of whatever good you may send me," because that clearly is the pinnacle. It shows that although he himself was a refugee, he did not shy away from his duty. And this is what Muslims can't do. We can't shy away from our duty, even though we are tired in our day-to-day lives and we're lethargic. We cannot shy away. He himself was a refugee, but he did not give up, but he only asked who could provide, and that was God.
Wonderful. So if you've got your own copies printed, it may be that in your classrooms you want to highlight that. Those items have been sent out through Helen, so it could be that your teachers get those retrospectively, and it's also in the PowerPoint that was shared at the beginning on this chat bar. Mason, thank you so much for that. If I could pass on to George.
Okay, so in terms of practical action, well, we tend to seek to serve people near at home in the church, but also overseas as well. So things like Christian Aid is an organisation that works across the world, offering support to people of all kinds of faith and cultures. In our neighbourhood in Ravensthorpe and Thornhill Lees, we're responding by setting up a food bank, and I'm doing this with people from the local mosque, people from another church, and others who want to be involved. And we distribute food parcels on a regular basis, and we distribute also supermarket food, which is running out on its use-by dates and best before dates, which we get given. So we go to parts of Dewsbury and give those away as free gifts. So I'm trying to give you an example of a sort of close to home and a further away kind of agency. Interestingly, in Ravensthorpe, we have SKT, which is Spreading Kindness Together. That is an agency that works within the Ummah, so for the Muslim community, but they also support anybody across the world, but they mastermind it all from Ravensthorpe, which is interesting. Is that enough? I mean, I think the text and the whole thinking behind all of this is that for a Christian person, as we serve those in need, we are serving Christ, because Christ is identified with the poor and the outcast and refugees.
Thank you very much, George. And just to pass on to Rabbi Jason for your thoughts on this, but at the same time, you may have seen that I've added another thing in the chat bar, which again links back to if students are studying the crime and punishment module. We also talk about, when it's right to break a law. And so in addition to saying, what are the practical ways that the Jewish community might support the organisations that we might look at, I'd like you also to answer a triple whammy. To what extent must refugees be supported, even if it does mean breaking the law? So a controversial one for you there.
Oh, I was going to fudge that by going with your other one about political activity, but we'll see what we can do. So likewise, what we see as a theme We see it with May Soon's community and George and their faiths, where organisations are there for everybody. Obviously, they're supporting the vulnerable of their own faith, but also for the wider community as well. Likewise, in the Jewish world, both internationally, there's an organisation called World Jewish Relief, which is kind of like a Jewish equivalent of Christian Aid in many ways, which isn't just helping Jewish people, but anywhere where there's abuses of human rights, where people, helping whether it's people, refugees, rights denied them. And locally in Leeds, we have a Leeds Jewish Welfare Board, which is a welfare organisation supporting the local community, not just the Jewish, but of all faiths. But before perhaps I come on to the issue of breaking the law, so there are also organisations, Jewish organisations, that help those who, sometimes there are issues of bureaucracy. People are refugees, but they are waiting for entitlements that are a long time coming. Have legal rights that are not being respected because of the system. They need representation, they need legal help, that kind of thing. And also areas in the world where why do people flee? Because of the nature of the regimes and pressure being put on certain regimes and connections in government to kind of put pressure on those places where people are not being treated fairly, that they feel they do have to leave and they do have to make a new life elsewhere. We have an organisation called the Board of Deputies in this country, which makes representation, again, not only in relation to Jewish people, but where there are human rights abuses that force people to feel they have to leave their homes in order to be safe. So, yes, political activity is an important part of this, but to what extent should they be supported, even if it means breaking the law? So, actually, can I throw that back to you, Jake? Can you give me a specific example of what kind of law breaking you may have in mind that the refugees may require, where the system isn't able to help them sufficiently?
So saying outside the system, if it means maybe transportation, bringing them in, I've certainly heard of religious individuals smuggling people in, certainly, and of course we know that refugees, are protected and have certain rights anyway. But what I'm saying is, will they be supported no matter what? Even if we say if there's a threat to them, is the most important thing that we ignore any legalities that are in place and bring them to somewhere that is safe.
Well, I think we need to be very careful. I mean, look, there are examples of, when you look at people escaping the Holocaust, for instance, you had a regime, you had a system, even when numbers were limited, Britain did what it could, but there were numbers limited and people had to get in through other means. So I think there's a difference between, if the system isn't robust enough to help, do you find ways outside the system, which aren't necessarily illegal, but can't rely on the system to deliver, as opposed to something that's illegal or not done in the approved manner. I think this kind of links to our earlier session about preserving human. If somebody's life is in danger, and by the time the system deals with them and you're trying to do it by the book, it is going to be too late for them. And as long as a person who's helping them, there's all the difference in the world between somebody who's a private individual who's prepared to put something, get somebody out of the country, without profit making. They're not a people trafficker who's using somebody's terrible vulnerability for their own personal gain. They're doing it because they genuinely want to help somebody and they feel there's no other way of doing it. So if that is what we mean by doing things not by the book, that there's no exploitation, it's not for personal gain, and then yes, I think a person, if there's no choice but to help this person, get this person food, get this person security and help, then yes, one should do that, but never from a point of view of exploitation or in any way getting gain from other people's suffering.
So if exploitation is not a part of it, it's in the pursuit of justice, if it's in the pursuit of the benefit of that individual, then we would certainly support that. I don't know if there's anywhere in the text that you might point us that would be, as we've said to our other speakers there, that the key quote for our students to take away, even if it's not specifically related to that particular issue.
Well, just that I kind of alluded to one of the quotes before where Jethro, the father of the daughters that Moses helped, says, ask him to break bread. This man who's come from afar invite him in. But also Moses rose to their defense. This kind of links, Jake, with what we just talked about. When people are subject to injustice or from nations that are need to be called out for their human rights abuses, we need to rise to their defense, to defend those who don't have a voice. So I think there's an idea also about, what causes refugees to be in the situation they're in, and how can you take on their plight in order to bring it to the attention of people who can make a difference.
Thank you very much. And if I could go over to George now for your reflections on that.
I think I agree with a lot of what Rabbi Jason has said. I suppose I have another question, really. Would you condemn a person for stealing a loaf of bread to feed their children? Technically, it's breaking the law, but I think it would be a hard person and a harsh society that threw the whole force of the law behind the person who was doing that. And sometimes, the law is an ass, as we say. It's clunky, it's overly heavy in dealing with situations which really require other ways of addressing them. And I think that the political aspects, the questions around why are people refugees, what are our politicians doing to stop people crossing in boats, in bad weather, in very vulnerable situations. And it seems to me that it's not an issue that we've really grappled with and engaged with successfully as a world community, not only as a nation and the kind of affluent West. We really need to look, I think, at how we do handle people who are displaced and where the root causes of such displacement can be addressed in more peaceful ways. So I don't know whether that answers the question for you. The key in the text, I think, is at the foot of it, there in verse 40, just as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me. So it's really about seeing that people who come to us in need are people whom we can serve as we would seek to serve God.
Wonderful. So for highlighting, we might there take verse 40 from that section. And I just noticed there that Alistair had mentioned that there is a tradition of peaceful civil disobedience. And so you might agree, George, that we might use the quote from St. Augustine that said, an unjust law is no law at all, which would certainly work with what Rabbi Jason was saying, whereby if it was a regime that was enforcing laws on people, then actually it might be that we don't consider those laws because they come from a place of somewhere that lacks justice. So if I want to just go on to Maysoon to finish off, your reflections on this, on that last question.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you. I think the answer is pretty clear in Islam. We have the commands of God, which are mentioned in the Quran, and we have to abide by them. But then, just as I was mentioning before, we have Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his teachings, and we have to also adhere to those, his sayings, his rulings, and we have to collaborate, work together with both the Quran and his teachings in order to understand fully the religion of Islam. So although we have seen that the Quran commands us to be welcoming to refugees and shelter those in need, we look to the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and he has told us that we are not able to break any laws of our country unless the but-for clause is here, unless there is a teaching against your religion. So if there is something that you can't do in your religion freely, then you are able to break your law. But if we look to the UK laws and regulations, there is nothing here that restricts Muslims from being Muslims, from allowing them to be free Muslims, pray on time, allowing them prayer space, The accommodation is all there, so there is nothing really that Muslims should be doing to break laws here. But I understand from a refugee perspective and from a refugee point, if there aren't certain laws and regulations within the UK, then who says, going back to Alistair's question about political movement, political activity, who says protests can't take place? Who says you can't go ahead and go through the House of Commons, the House of Lords, get white paper and a green paper, get the bills passed, get laws changed, get laws amended, get laws repealed? Why can we not do that? You have got the British values, which is the freedom of speech, which is your right, your human rights, which is your basic fundamental principles. So if you have all these rules for you, why would you want to go against it? So I think just kind of encompassing my whole answer in its entirety, we have the rules and the commands of God, of Allah, where we can't break them. But then I don't think it's a separate entity, because it's a match which is merged together for the betterment of society, for the betterment of community, and for the betterment of humanity in its entirety.
If I can come in there, thank you, Maysoon. I wonder if there's students familiar with the words refugee, asylum seeker, and economic migrant. They're three quite different words that overlap. A refugee is someone who's homeless. An economic migrant, someone who's moving because they're very poor or because there's no prospects where they live. And an asylum seeker is moving because of fear for their safety or livelihood, because of politics, basically. Do you think the views of faith communities or the quotes that you'd use would vary between those three people, or would refugees encompass all of those people? So economic migrants as well as asylum seekers in general, would there be any distinction, do you think, or would it all be in common hospitality?
I think from a religious perspective, Alistair, I think it would be common hospitality, simply because they are leaving their native land and they're migrating. And if we look to the stories from the Quran, almost, if not all, the prophets at some point in their life have migrated. Even if we look to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the final messenger, he's done the migration from his city, even though it was within Saudi Arabia, it was from Mecca to Medina, it was still a migration. So that belief and that warmth is still there, and it needs to kind of filter down regardless of the three divisions that you've mentioned, just simply because of making them feel welcome.
Let's qualify that a little bit. Obviously, of course, the welcome element is a common denominator, but there is a question of degree. So obviously somebody who is fleeing for their life or needs additional political help needs a certain type of help, which is different from the person there's a big difference between a person who already has a livelihood but wants a better livelihood. They're aspirational, all right? So they're not necessarily fleeing from persecution. And it may well be that they've got a certain life in another place and they want to look for a better life, which is fine, but do they need the same degree of assistance? Assistance, most definitely. But I don't think you can put the person fleeing persecution is in a very different situation from the person who's got a reasonable life in one place and wants to have an even better life in another place. You still welcome them and help them, but I don't think it's to the same degree.
It's interesting, isn't it? We used to, in the Christian tradition, where very often it was the church that provided relief for people in their community. We used to talk about the deserving and the undeserving poor, which is a bit of a Victorian term, and it doesn't sit very easily with us, does it? But I can see that you might want to make a distinction between the economic migrant and the person who is an asylum seeker seeking their safety, and the person who is a refugee who has lost their home. So maybe we do make a bit of a distinction there, but we nevertheless return to the overarching principle of welcoming the stranger and serving people in need when they are before us.
Thank you.
And I think that brings us pretty close to the mark, actually. So we're about 1 minute off finishing. And so I can't see any questions in the chat presently, but if you did want to send them on to us, I'm sure that our faith representatives will be more than happy to formulate a response, and we'd send that back through ourselves. So we're going to look at ending this session by saying thank you to all of you who have attended. So thank you, schools, thank you, teachers, for doing this. Scriptural reasoning is something that's really important in religious education presently. And a huge thanks to our faith representatives who've put time into so skillfully unpacking those texts and applying them to some of the elements that we will be studying in our schemes of learning and in our GCSE examinations.